Let's talk about Model Context Protocol. And before we do that, I should caveat this, that I am one of the core maintainers of the protocol that works on the open source project, and I'm also employed by Anthropic. So you might consider me a little bit biased. At the same time, this is my opinion. This is something that I think it doesn't necessarily represent the views of my employer or the open source project. So take this with a boulder of salt. Everything you see here, everything you hear from me is just my take on the daily debate that's happening on the internet, because when is the internet not debating about something? And the latest conversation that I got roped into and actually got asked about is, should I build MCP servers or should I build command line interface tools or CLIs for things that I want to expose to LLMs? And I think that's a fair question to ask, right? Like, it's not a bad one, because depending on your scenario, you might need different tools. I myself think of the work that I do in technological sense, if you will, to be very pragmatically driven. Let's put it this way. I use the tools that are most relevant for my work. I use Linux for my day-to-day development, and it's my daily driver. I use Windows for video editing and some of the gaming. I use Mac OS for work, and it's a tool in my toolbox. And I treat MCPs and CLIs the same way. And I say MCPs, this is maybe not the right term, it's MCP servers or MCP clients, but ultimately they're a tool in my toolbox. And just like you would choose the right tool for the right job, you should choose whether you use MCP or CLI depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Now, the question could be, are CLIs good enough? And I don't think that's even a debate. I think CLIs are good. They're great. They've worked for 50 years. We have proof. And at the same time, are they sufficient for every single scenario? And I don't think they are. I honestly don't think they are. And I want to dive in a little bit as to why. But before we do that, I want to cover something very, very important. And this, I think, foundationally key to understand for how MCP itself is designed and how the CLIs are designed, right? And for that, by the way, if you haven't checked it out, David Sarayapara, who's one of the co-inventors of the protocol itself, has written a document that you can read in 5 minutes. It's called Design Principles for MCP. It's available in the modelcontextprotocol.io website. Check it out. But it boils down to the fact that MCP itself, the protocol, is built around 8 principles. The first one is convergence over choice. It's very opinionated. That's all it means. It means that MCP has a strong opinion of how things should be done. Transports are done a certain way. Auth is done a certain way. That brings me to my next point, which is you have composability over specificity, right? So with a lot of these opinions, there is a set of predefined primitives, as MCP has and had since launch. Things like resources, things like tools, routes, and now even primitives that were recently added, things like tasks for more asynchronous processing. But everything can be assembled out of those primitives, and there's a desire to make sure that the protocol is not bloated beyond the core building blocks. Right. So if you have a box of Lego bricks, you can assemble things, but it's not necessarily you going and molding your own bricks because you want to build something, which of course you could, but then that doesn't quite work at scale. Also, MCP itself is focused on interop. This is the important part that is sometimes lost in the conversation, because MCP as a protocol, it's not just the protocol. It's not just the open source project. It actually is built for a myriad of clients and servers. So if you've used Claude, if you've used Visual Studio Code, if you use Cursor or Anti-Gravity or any of the modern editors or even LLM clients, MCP might have been there. And chances are you've used MCP yourself. But because of that, the focus is on making sure that whatever is designed in the protocol is designed with interop in mind always, because it's not just about the founding company behind MCP, Anthropic. It's about an ecosystem of clients. Very, very important. Also, the protocol is focused on stability over velocity. That's another core design principle that ensures that whatever is being put in the protocol contributes to the fact that it is adopted by everyone, it is compatible with everyone, and it works universally well. I think that's an admirable design principle, mainly because it recognizes the fact that we can move fast, we can add a lot of things, but we don't do that because we recognize that the protocol is a dependency for a lot of other folks. Also, capability over compensation, and that is because we focus on core primitives instead of trying to patch over some of the model shortcomings that might exist today. Because if you look back in the past 4 years, right? How did the LLM models evolve from when they first started, right? Like it's night and day. MCP is not designed to be basically a patch over the models. Like, we recognize the fact that the model capabilities are evolving and they will continue evolving. And the protocol still should provide those stable primitives that work across the board regardless of the model. Now, also, the protocol was designed with demonstration over deliberation in mind. So whenever we talk about new capabilities, we are focusing on very real customer scenarios, very real capabilities that need to be introduced instead of some abstract, desire to implement some new RFC. Because people get very excited about adding things to MCP, but that's not because there's a need, right? Because people want to just write code. And especially as engineers, we get very, very tempted to just come up with engineering solutions to everything, which is great. Engineers are very easily kind of steer in the direction of like, this is such a cool engineering challenge, let's go build this. But that's not what the protocol is about. Also, the protocol is very intentional about things like pragmatism over purity. And that is all the trade-offs that happen within the protocol itself are in service of its adoption. Some choices, some architectural choices might not be ideal all the time. And that's okay, because the goal is to make it easy for clients and servers to adopt and use it instead of being the perfect implementation, the perfect optimization for performance or scalability or anything like that. Now, that's not to say that that's not a focus, like perfect stability and scalability, but it certainly comes with a set of trade-offs that are very MCP specific. And then, of course, lastly, standardization over innovation. That is key in understanding that MCP is all about codifying patterns that have been proven valuable already instead of inventing new paradigms for the sake of inventing new paradigms, right? Because as I just mentioned, like, I myself am an engineer. I get very excited about new ways to do things and try it out. But ultimately, unless it's proven in the wild, unless there's very specific merit behind it, there's no reason to push in the protocol, because all the other principles that we just talked about will be negated by that. So keep these in mind as you think about MCP and the future of MCP. Now, let's talk about command line interface tools, or CLI tools, because that seems to be the suggested alternative to MCP. And CLI tools as a concept go way, way back. I want to say like at least 5 decades back. This is the days of you having a Unix box or Unix terminal in front of you, a keyboard that you could only type in text commands and get text output back. You had no windows. You could not drag anything with a mouse anywhere on the screen. So in those days, tools were built with the intent that they should work in a terminal, right? So naturally, CLI was the interface for that. And a lot of tools stood the test of time. So we still use tools like grep. And if you use Claude Code today, you know that Claude relies heavily on grep, right? It's an old tool that works really, really well. At the same time, we have a lot of tools that are more modern. We have JQ for JSON parsing. We have all sorts of CLIs for services like GitHub CLI, Wrangler for Cloudflare. You have AWS CLI. All sorts of tools that just run inside your terminal. And they're very easily composable. Like, you can use one, to GitHub CLI to produce some output, and it's going to produce you JSON, and then use JQ to parse that output. You can use pipe-based, basically passing one output to the other command as input. All these things, all these conventions are really, really powerful, and they work really, really well. So as I mentioned before, I don't think there's a lot of questions of if CLIs are good. They are good. Also, CLIs are good at being token efficient. Like, believe it or not, we're still living in the days when we are counting tokens. We have to make sure that we're not bloating the context window with unnecessary information. And this is where CLIs shine. There's no debate about that. I think that's a totally fair criticism of MCP as well, when there's descriptions that are overly verbose that just get inserted directly into the context, and all of a sudden your context window is basically blown because you had 7 MCP servers that had poorly designed descriptions for their tools. And the composability of CLI tools is also not bad. Like I no matter how I want to say that it's not perfect, it's not ideal, it does work pretty well. Like I have been trying to use a lot of CLI tools with Claude Code, and they work really well. And especially because Claude Code knows how to assemble them together. And then even if they're not perfectly matching the output to the input of the next command, Claude Code knows how to kind of use the model behind it to extract the right pieces and pass them on to the right next command. And it works. Right? It does work really well. At the same time, there is a lot of shortcomings. And I think this is where MCP comes in. And I think a lot of people miss the fact that MCP is a very opinionated set of guardrails for APIs, right? Instead of MCP, before we even debated about CLIs, people were talking about using open API specs to define APIs and then just say, why can't an LLM use an API if I just give it a spec? And you absolutely could, but then you're running into the problem of variability. Now you have to rely on a lot of different variations of commands, API structures, API outputs, API output formats, how you do auth between this API and this other API, right? Because once you open the gates to this, basically anybody can do anything, it's a free-for-all, you start running into scenarios of, hold on a second, but how do I do things like auth, right? That's one thing where MCP becomes very opinionated, because we do auth with OAuth. It's an open protocol, but everybody that wants to build an MCP server has to follow OAuth conventions. Like they have to build a system that essentially relies on an identity provider that issues tokens that Claude, for example, or any other MCP client can use. That is not nothing. That is a big, big ask from customers, and especially those in the enterprise where you want to have a level of that uniformity, a level of that universality. And MCP solves that for them. Things like authentication standards also are important for others that want to make sure that they're providing the right fine-grained access, right? Like MCP as a protocol bakes in a set of conventions for how do you request the right scopes? How do you make sure that you can provide the right set of limits and controls for the servers connected to the MCP client? With CLI tools, you can kind of achieve that if some tools do, but usually it can be all or nothing, right? Like you log in with the GitHub CLI tool with your account, and you can do anything that your account has access to, but it doesn't necessarily scope itself to the minimum required scopes and then incrementally increase it. So I think in this regard, this is where MCP, we start seeing kind of the benefits. The other piece that is important when we talk about security is basically isolation and the context in which the operations are running in. When you have CLI tools, they have to run on some VM, or maybe they have to run on your machine. That means there is unfettered access, or maybe there's some sandboxing depending on which tool you're using and which sandboxing methodology you're applying. But ultimately, you have a lot of risk in running a CLI tool on your box to do whatever that CLI tool wants. That's actually why I prefer remote MCP servers over local MCP servers, because local MCP servers are basically just applications that run on your box. And I don't like that. I like to be able to connect a remote MCP server that is basically an API that can then guide the model to do the things that I want it to do, but not necessarily do this on my box directly and expose me to more risk, right? Like that's an important thing that is oftentimes underestimated. Also, I'd say oftentimes people forget is that not everybody is a developer. It's like security concerns aside, isolation concerns aside, not everybody wants to run a CLI. I'm not gonna teach my grandma how to use a CLI to generate Word documents. I would rather have an MCP server for that. I will not go and teach my design friends how to use a CLI for pulling Figma components instead of using an MCP server that they can just connect to their tool of choice, whatever that might be. It could be Claude, it could be VS Code, and just basically use the built-in tools to do that, right? You end up in a world where distribution and the ease of integration and the ease of use become very, very important, right? If you look at the Claude connectors directory, those are MCP servers, right? Those are MCP servers that expose a lot of the services in a universal way. Remember back when MCP was announced, I don't know, maybe if you know, but it was the analogy that was used for it was that it is the USB-C for LLMs. And that's what it is. It's the universal standard by which anybody of any skill on any platform, whether it's Windows, Linux, macOS, can use those services right away. That's a superpower right there. That distribution, that ease of use is key for anybody to make sure that they're able to do things without necessarily jumping through a lot of the hoops to set things up, which is always a risk with CLIs. This is where I personally use a lot of CLIs myself, but I also understand that it's not ideal when I have to then go and teach somebody that, oh, you know what your model does? That actually you need to install this other piece of software. Oh, you need to run GH auth login before you can go and talk to GitHub. And granted, this is a developer scenario, but you get the vibe that I'm saying. It's complicated for somebody that is not technical to go and pursue these things. So where does this leave us? We talked about MCP, we talked about CLI, and I'm as convinced as ever that there's no binary choice here. There's no right answer. You have to use what gets the job done for you. And we know that a lot of the problems that have existed with MCP are being addressed in many different ways. Anthropic released a better way to discover tools inside Claude. We know that Visual Studio Code has released updates to their client that enable dynamic tool discovery so that not every single tool definition goes into the context. Cloudflare has released code mode, and Anthropic has written about an approach similar to this before that, of course, that enables anybody to essentially abstract away the MCP tools into code so that the model calls it directly when it needs it instead of, again, populating everything into the context. It is all scenario dependent. So when you ask yourself whether you should use MCP servers or CLI tools and whether you should build one or the other, you should really, really think about what you're enabling. And who is this for? Because if I'm a developer, I'm super comfortable using a lot of the CLI tools. I use JQ, I use Wrangler for Cloudflare, I use GH for GitHub. That's actually one of the CLI tools that I don't think an MCP server is needed for. You can just use the CLI. For those things that run on my box that I am confident that I can just put inside a VM, put inside a sandbox, that's great to have a CLI for. I have no problems with it whatsoever, and I use this myself every single day, especially when I'm working with Claude Code, because Claude Code is phenomenal about using and invoking CLI tools and then taking parts of the output and passing it into other tools. It's great at that. But at the same time, I know that there are limitations to that approach, and it's not going to work for everyone. So if I'm somebody that is considering MCP, when should I consider building MCP servers for? And there's a few scenarios for that. One, cross-scenario distribution. I want this to run equally well regardless of the platform, whether it's Linux, Mac OS, Windows, it doesn't matter. I want to be able, my customers to be able to easily plug in an MCP server, and especially because I'm an advocate for remote MCP servers, they just copy paste a URL or go to something like the Claude connectors directory where they can just add it directly and not worry about exposing their machine to some random tool. Also, enterprise security guardrails matter. Like, I think this is an important undersold aspect of MCP servers, is because they make it easier to control what tools get exposed when and to whom. The authorization spec is very, very clear about things like incremental scope upgrades, token revocation, and a lot of the scenarios that enterprises care deeply about. This is where that flexibility to exposing a guardrail around a set of APIs makes a ton of sense and makes a huge difference for a lot of the enterprise deployments. Also, if your users are non-technical, again, you can't necessarily teach them to use a VM or a sandboxing environment. I know we're all very excited about a lot of these capabilities where we can just run everything on my machine. I just went and bought a Mac Mini to run something on it, but that doesn't work for everyone. And sometimes you just need that capability contained within the LLM client, and that it cannot do anything outside of the specific set of tools that it was designed to do. So those are great. Also, I want to call out the fact that you do not need any infrastructure beyond the MCP servers themselves, wherever they run, whether it's functions or some compute nodes somewhere. For somebody that wants to run it on their machine and make it accessible across clients, MCPs shine at that. This is what it was designed for. Back to the point of universality, very, very important for a lot of the users. And especially with the emergence of tools like skills or agent skills now that start combining MCP servers and CLIs and scripting and a lot of the custom code, we'll see the lines blurred even further. I'm convinced that all of these will coexist. And of course, I can look back in 5 years and see that I was completely wrong. It is entirely possible because nobody knows the future. And at the same time, seeing how MCP is being adopted today, I think it will be there for a while.